So there has been a 0.8% decrease in unemployment, with data from Stats SA showing that the unemployment rate has gone down from 35.3% reported in the last quarter to 34.5%. Now, the biggest job gains were recorded in community and social services, manufacturing and trade. However, there were job losses in private households, finance, construction and agriculture. Meanwhile, fuel has increased by over R2 a litre as the government announces an extension of the reduction in the fuel levy by another 2 months. Last month, the government reduced the levy for petrol from R3.85 per litre to R2.35 per litre. Development economist and chair of Oxfam, Phelisa Nkomo, joins us now. Nkomo, I beg your pardon, joins us now for a conversation. Phelisa, good to have you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, Leanne. Thank you. Good morning to the viewers at home.
You know, I must say, I mean, all of the numbers going out, that are coming out, looking to the state that South Africa is in right now, whether it's the unemployment rate, whether it is the cost of living that is going up on a daily basis for South Africans. You now wake up to petrol that's increased, food prices have increased, and salaries are not increasing. In fact, people are just not finding jobs. We're in a very difficult position. Give us your views on all of this.
Yes, we're likely to be in a difficult position for a while, by the way, because even though I think the decrease by 0.8% presents a kind of like a positive picture, it's a mixed picture at the same time. But what it also signals is that, in fact, government needs to play such a crucial role in ensuring that it contributes into the stimulation of the economy. So that's the first issue. I think the second issue is that, I mean, in sectors where, for example, agricultural sector has really been the glue that has held this economy together in the last 3 years. In fact, it's been growing and also creating jobs. And if it's on the decline, so clearly it means that, you know, the impact of a Russia-Ukraine war is actually, you know, starting to hit home very badly. And I suppose this is as well with fuel. So obviously it requires, you know, a much more state interventionist approach, which already I'd seen a release yesterday from Parliament, where the Minister of Finance had written to Parliament to look at the insulation approach that government needs to undertake to make from fuel prices. And I do think that now it's a time where I think government needs to present a very concrete program on the table. And by the way, this is what the president had promised in the State of the Nation address in January. He had said that in 3 months or in 90 days, we will be presenting a very clear recovery plan. And it's actually time for that. But also at the same time, it also means that industries that actually are able to, that are struggling, firstly, to create jobs, actually needs to start reaching out to the government and say, what is it? What type of assistance that they require? But also those industries that are actually able to create jobs now, is that we actually need to look at what were the drivers, because some of those jobs that have been created in several sectors, which is particularly manufacturing and trade, is that, as I said, that is actually a positive signal, but we need to look at exactly what are the signals, because remember, some of these jobs were created in the first quarter. We actually don't know what's going to happen in the second quarter and as well as in the third quarter. So we really operate in an unpredictable space, uncertain, with a lot of volatility. And it's going to require a very tight coordination, by the way, between government, private sector, and as well as trade unions, in as far as what is it that needs to be done. So I know that there's been an open conversation around compacts, you know, and I do think that this time around it's really going to be different type of compacts instead of the compacts that we actually know. You know, instances like this where the economy is actually not doing well, by the way, present an opportunity again for a much more domestic, you know, galvanization and conversation in as far as how do you then shift from an export-led economy into an employment-led economy. Indeed. So an employment-led economy means that you start focusing on critical industries. Textile industry, for example, is linked to the agricultural sector, and it means that there needs to be a much more tighter coordination there. But also fundamentally, the department responsible for industrial development needs to be given additional resources. We can't be spending less than 10% on GDP for industrial support or industrial development and spending more than 40% on social security. It's a misnomer, and I think there needs to be a shift of resources within the public sector and looking at other macroeconomic tools that we can use to make it sure that we stimulate the economy.
So, Phelisa, I mean, we've been, this has been the songbook of government for years now. We've been hearing the same rhetoric and the same thing, that we've got to grow the economy, that we've got to create jobs, that we've got to create meaningful livelihoods for all South Africans, but we haven't seen it happening. Now, obviously, with everything around us, we're beginning to understand how bad the situation truly is, because even when times were not as bad as they are right now, there was still no growth in the economy. There was still no creation of jobs. So how can government do things now under these almost impossible circumstances? I mean, how can they do things differently? Can we really trust them to make the situation better?
Look, I mean, they can. And I think what is really, really required is actually political willingness and better economic architecture from a coordination perspective. And let me unpack exactly what I mean. From a political willingness perspective, that there needs to be shift, for example, in more spending on social security into the industrial development. So the point I'm making is that if you're spending 40% of your GDP in terms of your budget and 10% on industrial development, you're likely, in fact, to experience exactly the issue. So even in good times, for example, where global economy is doing well and even South African economy is meant to be doing well, we've not been able to grow our GDP beyond 2%. So what that signals, it means that there's a misallocation of resources, from a fiscal perspective. I think that's the first issue. I think the second issue fundamentally is to immediately, for example, focus on rolling out infrastructure program. So National Treasury is sitting with almost more than 50 billion in the infrastructure fund. But obviously what becomes a challenge is the fact that you find municipalities and sometimes provincial governments are unable to execute this infrastructure program, which in fact are meant to stimulate both supply side and demand side. But then there's a third leg, which is really a thorny issue within our macroeconomic organization in the monetary policy side, which I think you might be aware that we've just experienced increase of interest rate. Now we know, for example, the negative multiplier effects are so associated with increases. Firstly, it means that it takes away any form of additional income surpluses at household level. So it means that citizens and households are paying a little bit more. That's the first issue, so meaning that they're not able to save, nor even spend on durable goods. Secondly, there's an inverse relationship between investment and interest rate. It means that, businesses are actually going to struggle to spend their money, nor even access to credit, right? And it's even going to be even worse for small, medium enterprises. In fact, we know, for example, I think the Labour Force Survey kind of really paint a very clear picture that you do have a bigger component of an employer, which is informal sector in this economy, and as well as SMME. And we know generally that SMME is remaining engine of growth in many of the countries in the world. And some of them is family business, and some of them is actually started by, entrepreneurs. And that sector requires, support. But now, once we introduce interest rates, again, that's an inverse relation. But also, so in essence, so when you look at the multiplier effects, of that. So it means that, by the way, interest rate increases get to benefit the banking sector, for example. That's one. But also, it also means that we are going to entirely rely on, foreign investment all the time, because when our interest rate increases, we might be what we call a hot market, where people are churning in their money into the South African markets for them to earn, a little more from their own savings. But then the fiscal tools, right? So you then need to look and say, what type of other fiscal tools? Now, social security has been actually, been one tool that seemed to be effective to hold, families together, but that's not sufficient. But the biggest issue, as I'm saying, at least in the next 3 years, what South African governments need to do is to make sure that it makes South Africa a construction site. That way, you unlock, for example, in your remarks, Lena, you make the point about decline in construction. So if you then use your funding of infrastructure spending, right, you unlock almost every sector that is linked to construction, which is construction. It's going to be logistics sector, for example. It's going to be stainless steel. It's going to be even steel industry. It's going to be wood making industry. So you can see how many sectors that are actually linked to construction sector. And even now, there's even a technological component. I mean, if you look at even the spending of the state-owned enterprises, which is, PRASA, you can see our infrastructure, for example, is getting dilapidated, and meaning that almost every traffic of commuters is getting on the roads on a daily basis. PRASA infrastructure, Transnet infrastructure, Eskom infrastructure, and as well as even telecoms, broadband infrastructure.
Phelisa,
the issue around the cost of data is much linked to the development of broadband infrastructure.
Well, these are all lots of things that we've been talking about for a while. We have been, and I think it's important. You raise such key issues, and we hope that these are the things that are focused on. But let's talk to the reality. These are things that can be done, but they're not necessarily being done. Look at youth unemployment. We're talking 63.9%. The biggest band in the overall group of unemployed people in the country. Many are graduates, that they're struggling to find jobs. In the sectors that you've mentioned, there's also a high dropout. Surely this is the biggest worrying problem that we've had. Every single sector you've spoken about, these are the youth that should be going into them, and they're learning, they're graduates, but they cannot find the jobs. 63% unemployed. This is a major worry.
In fact, it's actually a social instability, Liana, by the way. It's a social instability to have so many young people. And that's why most of us as women, you and I, cannot walk in the street today at 8 o'clock because we're scared of gender-based violence. And often we make a disconnect between the economic structure and actually gender-based violence in this country. And that part of it is that crime is creating serious social instability as well as gender-based violence. And I thought that's an important point to make. But now the issue around young people, for instance, for me, it just really gives me a sleepless night as a social justice activist and as a development economist. And amongst the key issues as well that we've really been struggling as well is the coordination. So let me break it down exactly what. Now, one of the key issues, the point I was making about, lower allocation of funding for industrial development is actually linked as well to human capital investment, because there needs to be the human capital investment strategy of the country must be aligned to the industrial development. Now, what has been happening in South Africa, and that's why everyone else keeps on saying, oh no, we have the structural issue around skills mismatch. And if, for example, you interview anyone in the private sector, they will say young people are actually unable to, to meet some of our own skills expertise that we require in the market. And what it means is that young people are taught something else, they're not prepared for the market, and then the market is requiring something else. And we've been spending a lot of money within SITAs, and I'm hoping to see one day where we're able to see what is it that actually SITAs have been doing. They've been around for the last 15 years, and what impact they've been making in the economy. Yeah. So I think the third issue I want to make is that, and that's why I'm talking about the need for coordination and a much more agility. And this agility is linked to the point I was making around political willingness. Because the reality is that we have three spheres of government, right? That most of them you find a lot of duplication in as far as the deliver. And I'm not going to even get there around the inefficiencies in the system. But also one of the sphere of government that is actually meant to interface with citizens and young people, it's local government. And we've seen the weaknesses within local government. You'd know, for example, even in the National Development Plan, where there's a whole issue around, building state capacity. Now, the key question is we can't, because part of the failures we're confronted with, it's political willingness, state capacity, it's a misallocation of resources in terms of where do we, put the resources, but also fundamentally is also coordination, right? Yeah. Because the type of skills requirement we need in the public sector are those that are meant to actually facilitate access to these opportunities that we just don't speak. You tell me, why would National Treasury be sitting with over 50 billion, for the last 2 to 3 years of infrastructure fund that has not been utilized, when we know that I don't even want to talk about potholes, but we have communities where people have to cross the river, in a bucket, or they and if the river is full, they'll have to wait for another 2 days or 3 days and sleep over in other people's houses. So for me, it actually clearly indicates or signals incapacitation right at the lower level. And if government does not, in fact, make it sure that it transfers some of the capacity, because central government, by the way, or national government, is sitting with a lot of technical capacity.
Indeed. Phelisa, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. Sorry, Phelisa. Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there, but I think you've given us some great thought on the economy and where we're at right now. Development economist and chair of Oxfam Phelisa Nkomo giving her reaction on economic matters, including that slight decreases in the unemployment rate by 0.8%, while consumers basically squirm over fuel price increases this morning of almost 2.50 a litre. All right, so much to get through on the show. We're already in news time. Let's get into it.